The beacon was manufactured on a colony tender called the Sarith Provider in the 43rd year of the old Lethavoss expansion period, on a production run of 1,100 units, all of them rated for deep survey colonial operations in the outer Veth corridor. That information is in the salvage log I filed with the Vithrani Reclaimer Archive 9 months after the fact, and I include it here because it is the only honest way to begin. This was not a plan. It was not bravery. It was not the product of any wisdom on our part, or any particularly good judgment, any strategic calculation about who might answer a call fired from a derelict colony shelter vessel, hiding in the shadow of a moon that the Vareth sovereignty had just announced was no longer ours. It was a procurement error made 40 years before I was born. I should know. I spent 11 days trying to explain it to 3 separate councils, 2 senior fleet officers, and 1 very patient Terran Commonwealth liaison named Lethavoss Adalian, who listened to all of it with the kind of flat professional patience that I have since come to recognize as the default register of a man who has seen stranger things than a 6-ship fleet arriving to honor an obligation that the people who triggered it didn't know they had. He told me, eventually, that it was not unusual. I did not believe him. I still don't entirely. But I have had 2 years to think about what happened in the orbit of Veth Cethar, and the thinking has led me back to the same place every time. Beacon did what it was built to do. The rest of us were simply not told. The Unbroken Corridor was never supposed to be a refuge ship. She was a bulk freighter converted in the 16th year of the Reclaimer Settlement Program, when the first wave of Vithrani colonists had pushed out past the Veth Interior Corridor and needed something large enough to carry drilling rigs, habitat modules, and the kind of heavy hydroponics equipment that makes a barren moon livable over the course of 2 or 3 generations. The conversion was done in the Cethar repair docks over the course of about 14 months. The forward cargo bays were segmented into berth rows with collapsible partition walls. The water reclamation system was tripled in capacity with a secondary tank array that ran the full length of the lower deck, and a pair of backup atmospheric processors were bolted to the underframe, in a configuration that the original builders would have considered structurally conservative to the point of redundancy. The atmospheric processors were rated for 300 occupants each. Nobody involved in the conversion appears to have asked why a bulk freighter expected to carry drilling rigs might ever need to sustain 600 people simultaneously. The answer, I suppose, is that they were building for worst cases, and worst cases have a tendency to be worse than the ones you plan for. Those processors were still running when the Vareth sovereignty sent its enforcement notice. I had been captain of the Unbroken Corridor for 6 years by then. I had done grain runs and equipment transfers, and once, a medical evacuation that nobody in the Reclaimer administration wanted to officially acknowledge, because the settlement it came from had been established without the sovereignty's formal permission, and the administration was still in the early stages of negotiating its legal status. The evacuation was small, 37 people, 2 of them injured, one of them a child who had to be carried because she had broken both ankles in the rockfall that had prompted the evacuation in the first place. And it was handled cleanly, and by the time the administration missions had decided how to characterize it officially, people involved were already settled in a recognized community at Lethavoss Station, and the question had quietly stopped mattering. I had learned early in my tenure that the corridor was a ship that absorbed inconvenient situations. She was large enough to carry a problem, and slow enough to make it somebody else's concerns. By the time she arrived, she had 3 decks of berth space, a medical bay the size of a respectable clinic, and an engineering bay that Orith Sums spent 4 years optimizing, to the point where it would have been more accurate to describe her as the ship's actual operating principle, and the corridor as the mechanism she used to move it around. She was not built to carry 400 people with nowhere to go. The sovereignty's enforcement notice arrived on a 6th day, which, in the Veth Outer Corridor reckoning, means the long cycle period between the settlement's twin orbital passes, when the relay net is thinnest and messages sometimes arrive without the standard authentication headers. Ours came fully authenticated. It came with a flag from the Legal Dispatch Bureau, A green and silver stripe that I had seen exactly once before. Decommission order for an old survey installation near the Veth interior relay chain. The flag meant, this is not a negotiating posture. The notice gave the Sether settlement community 40 hours to initiate voluntary departure from Moon Veth Sethar, on the grounds that the original settlement charter had expired under the sovereignty's new Land Tenure Revision Code, Section 41, Article 7, which had been passed 8 months earlier without, so far as any of us knew, any meaningful consultation with the communities it affected. The Sethar settlement had been on Veth Sethar for 62 years. They had buried 3 generations there. They had built a water extraction network that ran 200 meters down into the bedrock and supplied the entire South Plateau community and the dome settlements in the Veth lowlands. They had a school with 400 students and a medical clinic that served the outlying survey camps twice monthly, and a community hall that had hosted the settlement's annual gathering every year without interruption since the 31st year after founding. The 31st year's gathering had been disrupted briefly by a seismic event that cracked the dome, but the settlers had repaired it themselves in 4 days and held the gathering anyway, which was the kind of detail that tends to get recorded in settlement histories because it says something about the people who wrote it. 40 hours. I will not describe the next 36 hours in any detail, because what happened in them is the province of the archive and the official record, the legal review board. Not this account, and because several of the decisions made in that period are still under active review by the reclaimer, legal counsel. What I will say is that when people have 40 hours to leave a place their grandparents built, they do not leave cleanly. They leave in the way that humans or people who think like humans, which is what the Vethrani are, more or less, underneath the things that differ leave things that were supposed to be permanent. With too much, and not enough simultaneously. Children who keep asking questions that cannot be answered well, and elderly who move more slowly than the schedule allows, and the specific, particular grief of the person who has to decide what to leave behind, because there is not enough room to take everything. I supervised the boarding from the main ramp through the final 6 hours. My crew worked alongside the settlement's own coordinators, and the was orderly, by the standard of what it was, which is to say that nobody was left behind and nobody was significantly hurt, and the ramp closed on schedule. And if what happened on the settlement's surface in those final hours before the ramp closed was more than I want to put in this account, that is because this account is about what happened afterward, not before. By the time those 36 hours were up, the unbroken corridor was in low orbit around Veth Sethar with 3,412 people aboard. I had been told 400, but Orith Savan had done a recount at my request and found 12 more in a rear cargo bay that had been loaded in the final hour without proper manifest notation. We found them when Orith went aft to check the atmospheric processor load and discovered that the bay's ambient CO2 was reading slightly above threshold, which was how we learned that the bay contained 12 people who had come aboard during the loading chaos and had not been any list. We processed them through the standard manifest system, and Orith opened the bay's ventilation duct to the main circulation, and the CO2 came down within the hour. That was my introduction to the kind of arithmetic that would govern the next several weeks. The difference between the number you think you have and the number you actually have, and what that difference means for everything, that depends on counting correctly. The Sovereignty Enforcement Corvettes were in the middle orbital band when we achieved orbit. 7 of them, holding position in a configuration that my navigation officer, Terath Andus, described as a holding perimeter. Not an attack posture, he said, a containment posture. We were not being shot at, we were being kept. The Sovereignty's second notice arrived 4 hours after we'd achieved stable. This one did not carry the green and silver stripe. It carried a plain administrative header, which, in my experience, is the kind of header that gets attached to things the sender expects to be filed, processed, and eventually lost in the larger machinery of bureaucratic inevitability. The notice informed us that the unbroken corridor was in violation of Sovereignty Transit Code Section 19 by occupying orbital space above a disputed territory without a current transit permit, and that we were required to hold position pending assignment of a transit corridor to an approved relocation zone, which would be provided within. And here I remember reading the number twice, and then reading it a third time to be certain. 90 to 120 standard days. 90 to 120 days. We had food reclamation running at 3,412 people over a system designed for colony transfer operations lasting no more than 14 days at peak occupancy. Orith had already told me, in the flat tone she reserves for information that is important and not improvable, that we could hold sustainable supply for approximately 50 days, with strict rationing across all berths, and that the figure dropped to 35 if the forward hydroponics bay developed any of the root mold issues she'd been managing with inadequate UV filtration for the past 3 months. She had been managing it successfully, she said, but the word she chose, managing, was a word that engineers use when they mean, I am holding this together with the resources available, Sheen, and the resources available are not what the problem requires. I filed a formal humanitarian exception request with the Sovereignty Dispatch Bureau. It went in on our second day in orbit, fully documented, with a supply assessment attachment that Orith had prepared and that I had not altered, because her numbers were correct, and correct numbers are the only kind worth sending. I received an acknowledgement receipt. I filed a second request, TEAT. This one addressed to the Bureau's senior director rather than the general intake queue, and flagged with the Humanitarian Emergency Classification Code that entitled it to a 48-hour processing guarantee under the Sovereignty's own Administrative Code, Section 12. I received an acknowledgement receipt. I called a full officers' meeting on the 4th day and asked for options. Orith Savin had been my chief engineer for 4 years. She was, in my experience, a person of absolutely consistent good judgment in 2 areas: mechanical systems and the avoidance of unnecessary expenditure. She had come to the corridor from a decommissioned survey tender whose crew she had kept functional for 11 months past the vessel's rated service. Life through a combination of precise maintenance scheduling and a philosophical approach to component replacement that could be summarized as, if it still works, the burden of proof is on the argument for replacing it. She had brought this philosophy to the corridor, and in 4 years it had served us well. And the ship's maintenance record was, by any reasonable measure, better than it had any right to be for a converted freighter of the corridor's age. It was this philosophy that had led her, 6 years before the Sovereignty notice arrived, to leave intact the colony emergency beacon that had come with the corridor's original equipment. Manifest when she took over the engineering department. She had logged it in her first week inventory review. 1 colony emergency beacon, Lethavoss colonial equipment, Model CE9, rated for 40 standard years of dormant storage, unlimited activations, full charge, no apparent fault indicators. She had noted it, cross-referenced the model against the engineering manual index, confirmed the activation procedure, and moved on to the items that actually required attention. I had asked about the emergency equipment during my own captain's onboarding, and she had walked me through the list. The beacon, she had said, was in perfect condition, no reason to replace it. I had filed this information and moved on. I did not ask what channel it broadcast on. I did not ask which emergency authority it was registered with. I did not ask about its certification history, or whether its underlying protocols had ever been reviewed since original manufacture. It was a colony emergency beacon. It broadcast a distress signal. If we needed it, we would use it. In the officers' meeting, it's a summary of our options on the forward display. She had organized them by response timeline and probability of success, which was her preferred format for briefing options, and I had long since stopped trying to get her to present them any other way, because her format was correct. We had the sovereignty exception request, which was producing acknowledgement receipts on a timeline that bore no relationship to the timelines on our food supply. We had our fuel reserves, which gave us approximately 14 days of low-power orbital holding and no useful transit capability without a transit corridor assignment. Attempting unauthorized transit through a sovereignty-enforced containment perimeter with 412 people aboard was not listed as an option. I did not need Ondas to tell me why. We had 3 portable supply caches that the settlement had loaded in the final boarding hours. Food and water for approximately 8 days at full vacancy, unrationed, useful but not decisive. And we had the colony emergency beacon, which Orith had checked that morning and confirmed was in full working order, charged to 100%, and ready to transmit. She had cross-referenced it against the Vethrani Reclaimer Administration's emergency communication protocols. Her recommendation was to activate it on the administration's standard humanitarian emergency channel. The signal would reach the administration relay at Lethavoss station within 4 to 6 hours. Was well inside the administration's 12-hour emergency response window. The administration wishes would send vessels, not warships. They didn't operate warships, but transit assistance ships with humanitarian exemption authorization that permitted them to operate in sovereignty space under the exemption agreement currently in effect. She projected response time, including travel, at 18 to 22 standard hours. She did not tell me that the beacon had a Lethavoss compact certification stamp. I did not ask. I authorized the activation. Orith went below to her engineering bay, powered the beacon from its dormant charge, confirmed the signal integrity on her console, pressed the transmit key. The beacon broadcast on every channel it was built to broadcast on. What she did not know, what none of us knew, was that the beacon was not a standard Vethrani Reclaimer Administration unit. It was a Lethavoss Compact Certified Deep Survey Colonial Emergency Beacon, manufactured to the specification of the old Lethavoss Colonial Expansion Compact, which had governed the Outer Veth Corridor Settlement Program for 23 years. Before its dissolution 40 years prior, the compact had been a mutual protection and resource-sharing agreement between 7 signatory bodies, the Vethrani Reclaimer Administration's predecessor organization among them, covering a broad swathe of outer corridor colonial operations in a period when the corridor's distances made independent emergency response structurally unreliable. No single body in the compact could guarantee response coverage across the full operational range. The mutual protection framework existed because the individual alternatives did not work. The Terran Commonwealth had been one of the 7 signatories. The compact had included, among its other provisions, Article 9 of the Emergency Response Protocol, a mandatory combined response clause requiring any signatory body receiving an Article 9 activation signal to dispatch a combined relief and enforcement response within 48 standard hours, regardless of circumstances, without exception for resource constraint, political consideration, or conflicting operational commitment. The clause had been written by a Commonwealth Colonial Affairs lawyer named Sareth Ondavel, who had argued in the drafting sessions that a discretionary response provision was, in practical terms, no provision at all, because discretion meant that the bodies most likely to need help were also the bodies least likely to have the political standing to compel a favorable discretionary decision. The mandatory nature of the clause, she had written in the drafting notes, was not a feature of the article. It was the article. Discretionary response is a promise. Mandatory response is a system. Promises fail under pressure. Systems do not care about pressure. Her argument had prevailed. The compact had dissolved 40 years ago when 3 of the 7 signatories reorganized into successor bodies that declined to carry the predecessor obligations. The Commonwealth had reviewed the dissolution instrument, and its Colonial Affairs Bureau had obtained a legal opinion holding that the survival provision in the compact's dissolution terms was binding on any certified hardware remaining in active circulation, that is, any Lethavoss Compact certified emergency beacon currently in service on a vessel or installation operating in the Outer Veth Corridor would, if activated, constitute a valid Article 9 trigger, and the Commonwealth was obligated to respond under the standing order, as though the compact were still in effect. The Bureau had issued the standing order to all Commonwealth patrol flotillas operating in the Outer Veth Corridor region. Monitor the Lethavoss Article 9 emergency channel by passive array, treat any activation as a mandatory combined response trigger, and dispatch in accordance with the Article 9 protocol. That standing order had been on the books for 40 years. 40 years it had been activated 42 times before ours. Adalian told me this later. 42 activations in 40 years. Works out to just over 1 per year, spread across the full length and breadth of the outer Veth corridor. He said this, with the matter-of-fact precision of a man reading from a file that he knows well, because it is a file he has contributed to. In 22 years of outer corridor patrol service, he had personally responded to 9 of those activations. He said, none of them knew what they were doing either. He said this without any particular weight. He was stating a pattern, but I found afterward that the pattern was the part I kept returning to. I did not know any of this when the contact report came in. I was on the command deck, reviewing the latest acknowledgement receipt from the Sovereignty Dispatch Bureau, and making the arithmetic calculation that my crew had stopped. Making aloud because making it aloud produced a number that nobody wanted to hear said in a room with no solution attached. When Tarathondas told me his passive array was showing an inbound contact signature. Not one, multiple. He read 6 contacts. Drive signatures consistent with warships. He paused, corrected. Consistent with a mixed formation. Warships and something larger. Something in the logistics carrier range. And one more, smaller than the logistics carriers, with a heat signature profile, he said he would characterize as a medical vessel if he were writing the contact report formally. He said, they are coming from the inner approach vector. Not from Sovereignty patrol space, I said. How far out, he said. 7 hours at current rate of approach. I looked at the 7 Sovereignty enforcement corvettes in the middle orbital band. They had not moved. Their formation was unchanged from the containment configuration they had held since our first day in orbit. Whatever was inbound had not yet generated a reaction from them, which meant either they hadn't detected it yet, or they had detected it, and were waiting to see what it was before deciding what to do about it. I sent a query to the Reclaimer administration at Lethavoss station asking for confirmation that they had received our beacon signal and were dispatching humanitarian assistance vessels. I had Ondas continue reading the inbound contact data while we waited for the reply. He told me that the contact signatures were consistent with Terran Commonwealth registry drive configurations. He could not be certain at this range. Profiles were distinctive, in ways he recognized from Commonwealth vessels he had seen before. He said this with the slight uncertainty of a navigation officer who has trained himself to hedge appropriately and is now hedging appropriately in a situation where he would prefer to be certain but cannot be. The administration's reply came in 40 minutes. It confirmed that our beacon signal had been received. It confirmed that the administration's emergency response vessels were preparing for dispatch. It gave an estimated response timeline of 18 to 22 standard hours. And it included, appended to the standard confirmation language, notation from the administration's Emergency Coordination Office, stating that the office had received an automated notification from a Terran Commonwealth relay station, which notification stated that Commonwealth Patrol Flotilla 11 had been dispatched in response to a Lethavoss compact. Article 9 activation originating from our position coordinates, and that the administration was in the process of requesting clarification from Commonwealth Colonial Affairs Bureau regarding the applicable standing order, which the administration had not previously been aware, was still in operational effect. I read this 3 times. Then I called Orith on the internal line to engineering. I said, "The beacon you activated this morning," she said. "Yes," I said. "What is the manufacturer's plate on it?" There was a pause, not a long pause, but the pause of a person who is crossing to where the equipment lives in the room and reading the plate rather than answering from memory, because they have learned over many years of engineering work that answering from memory about manufacturer's plates is the kind of thing that causes problems. I had always valued this about her. She said, Sareth Lethavoss Colonial Equipment, Model CE9, rated for 40 standard years of dormant storage. I said, "Is there anything else on the plate? Any certification stamps?" Another pause, longer. She said, "There is a Lethavoss Compact certification stamp. It says," she paused again, "Article 9 response channel." I said, "Yes," she said. "I don't know what that is." I said, "I believe it is the reason there are 6 ships coming toward us from the inner approach vector." Silence that followed was not a long silence, but it was the kind of silence that an engineer produces when she is processing a piece of information against a professional philosophy and finding that the philosophy holds, but that holding it has led somewhere she did not anticipate when she first did it. I recognized the quality of that silence. I had heard something like it once before, from a very competent colleague, on a different ship, in a different situation, when the thing they had been managing correctly for a long time turned out to have dimensions they hadn't been told about. She said, "I should have read the full certification documentation before logging it as compliant," I said. "The beacon worked exactly as it was built to work," she said. "That is correct," I said. "We will discuss the documentation process later. Right now, I need you to confirm that the beacon is still transmitting on Article 9, she said. "It is. I can see the channel status on my board. It's lit," I said. "Good, leave it lit." The Sovereignty Enforcement Corvettes detected the inbound formation approximately 40 minutes after we did, based on the timing of their response. The formation shifted from its containment configuration into something that Ondas described, after consultation with the military positioning references in his navigation database, as a cautious observation posture. Not retreat, not a defensive response. The posture of a command that has received new information and is now holding its previous action in suspension while it determines whether the new information changes the assessment. They sent us a query. It was formally worded, was how the Sovereignty conducted all its communications with us, and it asked whether we had recently activated an emergency beacon and under what authority we had done so. I replied that we had activated a colony emergency beacon in response to a humanitarian emergency, and that the beacon certification and response authority were matters I was still in the process of clarifying. I was told later, by a Dalian's protocol officer, that this reply was technically accurate in all particulars and constituted, in diplomatic terms, the functional equivalent of saying, "I know something has happened that I cannot fully explain, but I am prepared to own it entirely. I recommend you wait to see what arrives before deciding what to do. I am prepared to own it. I had 412 people aboard and 35 days of food if the hydroponics held. I was prepared to own a great deal." The six-ship formation arrived in Vethsether orbit 7 hours and 14 minutes after Tarath Ondas first read the contact signatures. They came in the way that a formation comes when it has pushed its drives and is still maintaining formation discipline, spread slightly wider than standard transit spacing, which is what happens when individual ships make small independent speed corrections during a hard approach, and nobody pulls them back into tight spacing, because there is no operational reason to do so at this stage. They were close enough to precise that the message was clear. They had come quickly and they had come in order, and the two facts were compatible with each other. 3 warships at the leading edge arrayed in a shallow triangle. The 2 logistics carriers flanking behind, separated by a gap that I estimated at about half a kilometer. The medical vessel to the rear keeping station. They came to geosynchronous orbit above us, and the formation deployed with the kind of efficiency that comes from a crew that has done this before. Not the efficiency of rehearsal, but the efficiency of repetition, which is different. The warships took station at 3 points around the orbital plane. The logistics carriers and the medical vessel held at higher altitude in a configuration that I found, looking at it on Ondas's tracking display, genuinely difficult to describe in terms other than arranged correctly. The Sovereignty corvettes held. No one fired anything. The silence on the tactical channels lasted about 12 minutes. Then a hail came in on my general communications frequency. The origin tag read, "TCW Enforcement, Flotilla 11, Flag Command, Commander Vossadalian." I answered it. Haran Vossadalian was a compact person with a broad, watchful face, and the kind of eyes that take in information without broadcasting what they make of it. He was wearing the Terran Commonwealth's standard gray and blue duty uniform, with the rank insignia of a flotilla commander on his collar, and nothing else decorative that I could see. He had a datapad in one hand and a stylus in the other, both held with the ease of a man who uses them as often as some people use their hands, without anything in them. His first words, after confirming my name in the vessel's registry, were, "All persons aboard the unbroken corridor, accounted for." and in current good health. I said yes, with the qualification that we had food reserves sufficient for approximately 35 standard days at current occupancy and were in significant need of supply assistance. He made a note on his pad. He asked whether the emergency beacon activation had been deliberate or accidental. Said, deliberate, but that at the time of activation we had not been aware of the beacon's Lethavoss compact certification or the Article 9 channel designation. He made another note. He said, that does happen, I said. Is that so? He said, more than you might expect. Pre-compact dissolution equipment is still in service on a number of vessels and installations throughout the outer Veth corridor region. The compact certification survival provision makes the Article 9 trigger legally valid, regardless of whether the operator understood what they were activating. We receive approximately 4 to 6 activations per year across the legacy signatory regions. The majority of them are your situation. Functioning equipment, operator unaware of the channel designation. I considered that for a moment. He continued. The unawareness does not change the response obligation. Article 9 is a mandatory combined response. Once the activation reaches our passive array on the Article 9 channel, the order is issued automatically. I do not have discretion to defer or to assess the intent behind the activation. The system runs, I said. I understand, he said. Regarding the sovereignty and force formation in the middle orbital band, we have transmitted them the Article 9 activation notice and the full mandatory response documentation under the Commonwealth Sovereignty Corridor Access Framework, Article 4, from the joint treaty signed in year 61. That article recognizes compact survival provision responses as valid transit protection actions in sovereignty-adjacent space. The unbroken corridor and all persons aboard are under Article 9 protection for the duration of the response and transit period. The enforcement action is suspended pending review under the joint treaty's dispute mechanism, I said, and if we dispute the treaty citation, he said. The dispute forum is the Commonwealth Sovereignty Joint Corridor Arbitration Board. It convenes twice a year. The next session is scheduled in approximately 7 months. He said this the way a person states a fact of the calendar, not with any pleasure in it, not with any particular emphasis on the implication, just the fact. I looked at the Sovereignty Corvette formation on Ondas's tracking display. They had not moved. The posture Ondas had described as cautious observation had taken on in the past few minutes. A quality I found difficult to name precisely, the quality, perhaps, of a group of people who have encountered paperwork that is older and more comprehensively documented than they are, and are now deciding whether the paperwork is worth the effort of contesting. I said, and the supply situation, he said. The Verith logistics carrier will begin supply transfer operations within the hour. Standard Article 9 provision is 90 days at current occupancy, emergency rations, potable water, and supplementary nutrition package for vulnerable populations. I see from the beacon signal data that your atmospheric processing load is above rated occupancy threshold. We will transfer 3 portable atmospheric processing units rated for 200 occupants each, which should bring your system within comfortable operational range. He made a note. He added, the medical vessel. Compassionate Accord will request boarding clearance in approximately 2 hours for initial health assessment of the vessel's population. Standard Article 9 procedure. I said yes, cleared. He said, I will come aboard myself once the initial supply transfer is underway. There is documentation relating to the compact and the standing order that you are entitled to receive in person. It will answer most of the questions you currently have. He ended the transmission. I sat in my command chair for a moment and looked at the logistics carrier on the tactical display, already beginning to shift toward docking approach. 90 days of supply, 3 warships and a medical vessel and a logistics carrier, and the first thing he had asked about was food. The supply transfer took 11 hours and 40 minutes. The Verith Logistics carrier's docking team was as experienced in this kind of work, in the way that people are experienced, in things they have done many times under variable conditions. Not the careful precision of someone doing something for the first time and doing it correctly, but the economy of someone doing something familiar and doing it efficiently. The umbilical lines went across in the first 20 minutes. The transfer containers began moving in the 35th minute. By the second hour, the corridor's main supply bay was receiving a steady stream of provisions at a rate that I found, watching the manifest tallies update on the bay monitor, genuinely difficult to reconcile with the numbers we had been living with for the past 4 days. Orith supervised the receipt of the atmospheric processing units personally. She sent me a brief message after the third unit was secured and tested. Online, within rated parameters, CO2 levels dropping in berth rows 4 through 7. She did not add anything further. She did not need to. 412 people, who had been counting meals and calculating days, were suddenly watching pressurized supply canisters come across on the umbilicals. I walked through the berth rows during the third hour of the transfer. I did not do this for any operational reason. I did it because I had 412 people aboard, and I did not know how to sit on the command deck and watch supply tallies update while they were doing whatever they were doing in the berth rows. What they were doing was watching. They were at the observation ports, as many as could find a position at one, looking out at the logistics carriers' running lights and the transfer lines and the steady movement of the supply containers. They were very quiet. The children were quiet in the particular way that children become quiet when adults around them have become quiet, not from instruction but from the ambient register of the room. The attentiveness of the people around them communicating that this was something worth attending to. I stopped at one of the observation ports in the row 6 berths and looked out for a while. The logistics carrier was large. Not military large, but large in the way of things built to carry a great deal of something over a great distance without complaint. Her running lights were steady and unhurried. The supply containers moved along the transfer lines with the regularity of a process that had been set in motion and would continue until it was complete. An elderly man standing at the port next to me said, without turning to look at me, "They're going to stay," I said. "They will stay until the transit authorization is issued and we are able to travel safely," he said. "And how long will that take?" I said. "I don't know yet, but we have food." He looked at the logistics carrier for a while longer. Then he nodded, once, and moved away from the port. I stayed a while after he left. There was nothing I needed to do at that particular moment that required me to be on the command deck rather than standing at an observation port in row 6 berths watching a Commonwealth logistics carrier run supply lines to my ship. That had the con. The transfer was proceeding correctly. The atmospheric processors were online. The first time in 6 days there was no active crisis requiring a decision from me in the next 10 minutes, and I found I did not immediately know what to do with that. What I did was stand at the port and watch the running lights. A woman came and stood next to me after a while. She was perhaps 30 years old, with a child asleep against her shoulder. She looked at the logistics carrier the way you look at something when you are not yet certain whether it is real or whether your exhaustion has become elaborate enough to invent it. She did not say anything. I did not say anything. We stood at the port together and watched the supply containers move along the transfer lines in the steady, unhurried way of a process that has been set in motion and will continue until it is complete. And the child against her shoulder slept through all of it, which seemed to me a good thing. The Compassionate Accords medical team came aboard 2 hours later. 3 physicians and 4 medical technicians, carrying cases of equipment that my medical officer Avith Saran met at the docking collar with the specific, controlled expression of a person who is doing the professional arithmetic of what she is looking at in real time and finding numbers she had not expected. She walked them through the berth rows and I gave them access to everything they needed. And they worked through the night with the focused efficiency of people who are doing the thing they came to do. By the end of the first day, they had assessed approximately 800 people. Avith sent me a summary that evening. 11 cases of early-stage malnutrition. 8 respiratory conditions she had been managing without the necessary treatment resources. 3 cases. She flagged them separately, and I knew from the flagging that the flagging itself was information that required immediate intervention. She added a note at the bottom of the summary. The Commonwealth team has the equipment I don't have. For authorization, I would like them to take primary on those 3 cases. I authorized it within the minute. A Dalian came aboard on the 3rd day. He brought 2 staff members, both of them carrying cases of documentation equipment. He carried his own pad and stylus and a second larger pad that he said contained the full Lethavoss compact text, the dissolution instrument, the survival provision, and the Commonwealth Colonial Affairs Bureau standing order. He said I was entitled to read all of it, that he would leave certified copies in the corridor's ship's record system before he departed. I had set up the officers' lounge as a meeting space. We had converted it for passenger use in the first days after boarding, and it still smelled of the meal packs that had been stored there during the early rationing period. I had moved a table back in and found chairs, and the space was adequate. And I did not apologize for it, because a Dalian was not the kind of person who needed an apology for a meeting room that served its purpose. He sat across from me and set his pads on the table and told me what had happened. He told me about the compact and its 7 signatories, and the Outer Corridor Colonial Program. He told me about Sarah Thondavel's Article 9 mandatory clause and the drafting argument she had made. And when he got to the line about discretionary response versus mandatory response, I said, quietly, discretionary response is a promise. Mandatory response is a system. He said, yes, that is the exact phrasing. He told me about the dissolution and the survival provision, and the legal opinion that had kept the standing order on the books for 40 years. He described the opinion in the neutral way of a man who had read it enough times to have no emotional relationship with it anymore. A legal finding was a legal finding, and his job was to act on it, and so he did. I asked him how many people in the Outer Veth corridor currently knew that the Article 9 channel was still live and the standing order was still in effect. He said, the Commonwealth's patrol flotilla commanders all know. The Colonial Affairs Bureau knows. The 7 legacy signatory bodies, or their successors, the ones that still exist, were formally notified when the standing order was issued, and again when it was reviewed at the 10-year interval. Whether that notification reached the operational level of their member organizations, he paused, is a question I cannot answer confidently. I said, the Vethrani Reclaimer Administration received a notification, he said. Yes, I said, and nobody in the administration thought to update the documentation. Supplied with compact certified emergency equipment, he said, that is a reasonable characterization of the gap, I said. My engineer kept that beacon, because there was no mechanical reason to replace it. She did exactly what a competent engineer does. She could not have done better with the information she had, he said. Correct, I said. The information she needed was in a compact certification document that nobody thought to tell her existed. He said, also correct. It is a documentation failure at the organizational level. It has been identified as such in previous after-action reviews for Article 9, activations. The documentation supplement for pre-dissolution equipment has been on the Colonial Affairs Bureau's review agenda for some years. I said, some years. He said, yes. I cannot make a more specific representation than that. I looked at him for a moment. I had spent 6 days in orbit above a moon my people had built their lives on, receiving acknowledgement receipts from a bureaucracy that was managing the situation as a transit code matter, and I found I did not have a great deal of excess patience for timelines applied to documentation reviews. I said so, not loudly, but directly, he said. I understand the frustration. I share it if that carries any weight. He said this without any particular softness in it, not as comfort, as a fact about his own position. He was a Commonwealth Patrol Flotilla commander who had responded to 43 Article 9 activations in his service career, and in all probability most of those activations had ended with a version of the same conversation. Someone sitting across a table from him who had been saved by a system they didn't know they were part of, and was now working out what they felt about that. And I believe he had arrived at the position he held on the matter, because the evidence pointed there, not because he was looking for a way to be easy about it. He said, the Bureau reviews it. The review concludes that the supplement should be issued. The supplement goes through the standard publication cycle. The publication cycle for legacy certification documentation runs on its own timeline, which is not the same timeline as operational events. That is the gap. It is not complicated. It is simply a mismatch between the speed of bureaucratic process and the speed of emergencies, I said. And in the meantime, people press buttons without knowing what they're pressing. He said, yes, and the system responds. I looked at him for a moment. I said, so the system works. The standing order, the mandatory clause, the Article 9 channel, the system works. And the gap in the system is not a gap in the mechanics. It's a gap in telling people what they have. He said, that is an accurate summary. I said, my people had 35 days of food. If that beacon had been a standard reclaimer unit, we would have waited 18 hours for administration vessels. If the root mold progressed in the hydroponics bay, it would have been shorter than that. He nodded once, I said. Instead, we got 6 ships in 7 hours. He said, yes, you got the system. He said it the way he said everything, without decoration. As a plain statement of what had occurred, offered to someone who needed to hear the plain version without embellishment. We spent 22 days in Veth Sether orbit. The Sovereignty Enforcement corvettes withdrew to the outer system on the 6th day. They went in good order, by the numbers, and they sent us no direct communication when they went. They sent one final transit code notice to the corridor's administrative queue, reconfirming that our transit permit reviews was pending assignment to the standard arbitration process, and that was the entirety of their farewell. I noted it for the record and interpreted it the way I interpreted most things from that quarter, as the expression of an organization that has encountered a situation it cannot immediately counter, and has filed the situation correctly for future processing. The 7-month timeline for the arbitration board's next session is a long time. People sometimes resolve things in that period that they could not resolve in the heat of the original dispute, when the thing is still recent enough to feel like a loss rather than a negotiating position. I had no particular expectation that this would occur for us. The Sovereignty's Land Tenure Revision Code was a structural instrument, not a personal decision, and structural instruments do not tend to soften in the interval between sessions. But I noted the corvette's departure and the manner of it, because manner is information, and the manner here was, we are not done, but we are not going to do it here. The medical team from the Compassionate Accord worked through the vessel's full population over the first 12 days. They found more than Eveth Soran had found, not because she had missed things, but because she had been working with what she had, and what she had was a capable diagnostician with inadequate tools, and the Commonwealth team had brought tools. 3 cases she had flagged were still alive at day 12. One of them was a child. I noted this in my personal record, but not in the official log because the official log was not the place for it. On the 12th day, Adalian's staff produced the transit authorization, Article 9 transit protection, covering the unbroken corridor and all persons aboard, from Veth Sethar to the Vethrani Reclaimer Settlement Hub at Ondavel Station, with a Commonwealth Logistics carrier escort for the full duration of transit. The authorization had been filed with the Sovereignty Corridor Authority under the Compact Survival provision by the Commonwealth Colonial Affairs Bureau. It had taken the authority 4 days to process, Adalian told me, with the carefully neutral expression I had come to recognize as his version of commentary on the situation, that 4 days was faster than the authority's standard processing time for filings of this type. I said, how much faster? He said, considerably. On the 18th day, the Reclaimer Administration's emergency response vessels arrived at Veth Sethar. They were good vessels, and their crews were good people. And the administrator, who came aboard, was genuinely sorry for the delay, genuinely glad we were safe, genuinely surprised by the scope of what she found in orbit. She was also, I think, caught in the specific kind of professional difficulty that comes when someone from your organization has already solved your emergency, and you must arrive and take note of this fact and manage its implications with appropriate dignity. She managed it with appropriate dignity. I assisted where I could. On the 22nd day, the unbroken corridor transited to Ondavel Station under Commonwealth escort. All 412 people arrived in good health. The medical team from the Compassionate Accord remained aboard for the transit, and they had arranged coordination with Ondavel Station's medical facility before we departed so that the 3 flagged cases would have a care path waiting for them when we arrived. They did. The 2, who were still being actively managed in transit, were transferred to the station's medical wing within the hour of docking. I learned later that both of them recovered fully, though full recovery in one case took most of a year. Adalian's flotilla reprovisioned at Ondevel Station for 6 hours after the escort concluded. He came to the corridor to say goodbye in the same manner that characterized everything else he had done. Precise, professional, and entirely without ceremony on his own behalf. He shook my hand. He confirmed that the Article 9 documentation was in the corridor's record system, he said. The standing order would remain on the books. I said this was the 43rd activation, you said. He said 43rd. Yes, I said. And in how many of those 43 did the operator know what they were activating? He considered for a moment. He was the kind of person who doesn't guess when he can count, and I waited while he counted. He said, 3 that I know of with certainty. Possibly 4, I said. And the rest, he said. The rest had functioning equipment. They used it. I filed the salvage log entry about the Sareth provider in the Reclaimer archive 9 months after the fact, as I noted at the beginning of this account. I filed it in response to the after-action report, template's requirement for a complete description of all emergency equipment used during the incident, which required the manufacturer and the model number, which led me to write the full certification history, which led me to conclude that the full context was worth setting down carefully, and not merely as a compliance entry. The archive flagged the entry for secondary review. Review went to the administration's equipment certification office, which had not previously known that Lethavoss compact certified beacons remained in active circulation aboard Reclaimer-affiliated vessels. The review ran 6 months. Its conclusion was that all such vessels should be issued a documentation supplement explaining the Article 9 channel, the survival provision, and the Commonwealth Standing Order, and that this supplement should be formally incorporated into the engineering manifest review cycle going forward. The supplement was published 3 months after the review concluded. It is 4 pages. It is written in the clear, precise language of official documents that are describing things which should have been explained earlier, and know it. It covers the Article 9 channel, the activation procedure, the mandatory combined response clause, and the response timeline for an Article 9 activation originating in the outer Veth corridor region. 7 hours at standard operational distance, 4.5 if the flotilla pushes the drives. I have spent considerable time with those numbers since I first read them. I do not mean that I have agonized over them. I mean that they have a quality to them, a specificity, that makes them useful to sit with. 7 hours is not an abstraction. It is a drive output and an orbital approach and a formation that arrives in good order and deploys efficiently, whose first question is whether everyone aboard is in good health. 7 hours, 3,412 people, 35 days of food, 17 days to administration vessels, 90 to 120 days to the sovereignty's assigned relocation corridor. Oreth pressed a button. 6 ships came in 7 hours. I have thought about the lawyer Serath Ondevel many times in the 2 years since we left Feth Sether, the one who wrote the mandatory clause and argued that the mandatory nature of the provision was not a feature of the article, but the T-scroll article itself, and who was present to see it voted through and then spent the rest of her career doing other things, and who died some years before the compact dissolved, and who therefore had no opportunity to observe what became of the provision she had argued for. I wonder whether she thought about it much after the compact was ratified. I suspect she did not. I suspect she did the thing she was there to do, and then moved on to the next thing, because that is what lawyers and engineers and captains and navigators and chief engineers all do. They do the thing they are there to do, and then they move on. I think about the procurement officer on the Sareth provider, who approved the production run of 1,100 CE9 beacons to the Lethavoss compact specification. I think about the equipment consortium that bought the Sareth Lethavoss company name after the compact, dissolved and preserved the certification standard in their product documentation, because the legal department said the survival provision made it. I think about the engineer at whatever factory those 1100 beacons were assembled in, who stamped the Article 9 response channel, designation on the certification plate, and moved on to the next unit in the run. None of them had us in mind. None of them knew that there would be a displaced colony shelter vessel in low orbit around Veth Sethar in the 83rd year of the Reclaimer settlement program, with a decommission notice and 35 days of food, and by someone who had been aboard for 6 years without ever asking what channel the emergency beacon broadcast on. None of them planned for us. They were not in that business. They were in the business of building a system that ran. The system ran. Keep the manufacturer's plate in my captain's file now. Orith removed it from the beacon housing after the salvage log entry was filed and gave it to me without comment, which is her way of saying that the comment is obvious. The plate is small enough to hold in one hand. Sareth Lethavoss Colonial Equipment, Model CE9, rated for 40 standard years of dormant storage, unlimited activations. Next to it, in the same file, I keep the documentation supplement. 4 pages, complete and precise and 40 years late in reaching us. I do not resent the lateness. Resentment is a register I have not found useful, and the people who might have closed the documentation gap earlier are not people I can productively address. What I can do is file the supplement, date the manifest, make sure that the next engineer who inherits this vessel knows what she has. The beacon is still aboard the corridor. It is still in full working order. Orith tells me that the charge held steady through the activation and has recalibrated to full on the passive, maintain cycle. She has added it to the primary equipment review schedule, and she updates the certification documentation log quarterly. She has also, I noticed on a recent review of the engineering manifest, added a note to the beacon's entry in the system. The note reads, Article 9, Lethavoss Compact Emergency Channel, Mandatory Combined Response, Commonwealth Patrol Flotilla Response Window, 7-hour standard, see supplement documentation. It is a small note. It contains everything the previous entry was missing. There is no mechanical reason to replace the beacon. There never was.